Good Shabbos. This week there's a double portion, Acharei and Kedoshim. Literally, Acharei means after the death, and Kedoshim means you shall be holy. And this week I'm speaking from Boston during the Shiva of my father-in-law, and I feel therefore it would be somewhat appropriate to talk about exactly the subject of this portion, at least the first two words after the death, and speak a little bit about my father-in-law, but in the context of the portion. So to preface my remarks, I'll go skip to the second portion, which is Kedoshim. In Kedoshim, it says, Kedoshim tihu, you shall be holy, or you shall be sanctified. And it's an instruction to the Jewish people that it's not just sufficient to do what you're supposed to do what's prescribed in the Torah, but to go that extra step. And Nachmanides, a very important commentator on the Chumash, actually says that the idea of Kedoshim is that you should go lifnim mishuras hadin, you should go beyond the letter of the law. And when you start reading the beginning of the portion of Kedoshim, you'll see that a lot of the Ten Commandments are included in those first few sections, but they're in what you'd call an enhanced version. So one of the commandments in the Torah is Kabed es avicha v'esimecha, you should honor your father and your mother. And here, in this week's portion, it says, Ish imo v'aviv siro, you shall fear or revere or respect your parents. And although it could be read in different ways, I like to think that respect is much more than honoring. Honoring is just doing what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to serve your parents. You're supposed to take care of them. You're supposed to listen to them. But tira'u, to fear them, to revere them, to respect them, is to understand them more and to understand what their real values are, and therefore to come to an ultimate respect of them. So that's an enhanced version. Right? It says, Lo sirtzach, you shouldn't kill. But in this week's portion, it says, Lo samad al dam riecha, you shouldn't stand by when your neighbor's blood is being spilled. That's not killing, but it's to go the extra mile to make sure you save someone. And on, many of the different Ten Commandments you see are sort of enhanced. And I want to focus on one of them, which is the whole idea of how you should treat your fellow man, which is really the subject of the last 5 of the Ten Commandments. And in this week's portion, we have more of a general idea, which is very well known as V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But really beforehand, there's something else in the portion. And I'd like to just read what it says. It says, Lo sisnas achicha b'levavecha, you shall not hate your brother or your neighbor, your friend in your heart. Hocheach tochiach es amisecha, you shall reprove or admonish your neighbor, your friend. Lo sisa lav chet, and you shall not carry any sin. There's many different ways to read this, and it depends on how you translate it. But I would suggest one way, which is mentioned by many commentators, is that it's saying, and then I should have said, the next verse goes, V'lo sikum v'lo sita, you shall not take revenge or not bear a grudge as b'nei amecha, against the people of your nation. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And then it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Ani Hashem, I am God. And I think the way some commentaries understand is that in order to love your neighbor, you first have to go the extra step and make sure lo sisnas achich b'levacha, you don't hate him in your heart. Because there's 2 ways to love your neighbor. One way to love your neighbor is to do acts of kindness. And actually, Nachmanides says that you can't really, the Torah really can't command you to love someone. That's an emotion. But it's only commanding you to do acts of love, to take care of them, to make sure they're supported in all their needs, and so on and so forth. But many other commentaries would disagree and say that no, V'ahavta l'reacha means you should actually love your neighbor. And the question is, how do you come to that point where you actually love them deep down in your heart and you have those emotional feelings to them and not just something on the surface? So I think that's why you have to go back to the previous verse, which says, Lo sisnas achich b'levacha, you shouldn't hate your neighbor or your brother in your heart. And how do you do that? So there's different ways of creating peace, creating harmony with your friend, your neighbor, your community, your family. And I've talked about this other times when you say Ohev Shalom V'Rodev Shalom. It says about Aaron, the high priest, that he loved peace and he ran after peace. So the ideal of creating peace, well, there could be two different types of peace. One type of peace is there's cessation of hostilities. Just think of the peace between Egypt and Israel for the last how many decades? What you call a cold peace. They're not fighting, they're not at war, but they don't really love each other. It's not really, it's peace that no war is happening. But the word peace, the word shalom, also is related to the word shalem, to be complete. And to be complete, it has to be full harmony, that you really get along. And to really get along, you have to make sure that you understand each other and that you really appreciate each other. As we said before with your parents, you have to respect them, you have to revere them, you have to really want to be close to them, not just because it's your obligation, because you really feel that way. And the only way to do that is to really explore what your relationship is, and to sometimes dig down a little deeper and perhaps get beyond peace and sometimes have a little bit of somewhat of an argument. And here's where I would tell you, this is the explanation of the verse. Before that, I just want to tell you that was one of the attributes of my father-in-law. My father-in-law was led a long life and had many different personality traits, but for our purposes, I just want to focus on one. He was a man who said what he thought. You knew what he was thinking, you knew what he felt about you, and he was very open about it. Now, some people are maybe turned off when they hear somebody who's just very honest about their feelings and tell them what they've done wrong or what you really think. But this verse in the Torah is perhaps telling you that you should sometimes do that. Why? Because it's saying if you don't tell people what they think, you might act superficially like you're their best friend, but really you're hating them in your heart. And it's saying, no, you shouldn't have those feelings deep down in your heart. You shouldn't hate your brother or your friend in your heart, but rather you shall reprove them. You should admonish them. You should really tell them what you think. Try to correct it. That's not always going to work. And sometimes people who admonish people just distance themselves further away. But it's an important balance that we have to create in life, where we have to understand that the way to really dig down and get our feelings out and, in a sense, almost purify them and be able to come to a point where you really have a deeper relationship with your friend, your family, your brother, your sister, your father, your mother, whoever it might be. The only way to do that is sometimes to tell them what you think. Not to tell them in a harsh way where you're just trying to show that you're right, but rather in order that you should remove the hate from your heart. You shouldn't hate him in your heart. And by being by reproving them, by telling them what you think, then you come to the next verse, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And here again, I've said this numerous times, the verse doesn't say it doesn't say you should just love your neighbor. Because loving your neighbor is what I said before, it's just doing acts of kindness. But it's kamocha. You should love your neighbor like you love yourself. The only way you can really love yourself, to appreciate yourself, is to understand what you're all about. To dig down deep and make sure that you really understand what you're all about, that you don't have you're not self-conflicted. And then when you really love yourself and know yourself, then you can come and love somebody else. Then you realize the same way that you want to be treated, the same way that you would appreciate someone tell you what they think in order to establish a good relationship, not just to be told off. That's how far you shall go in trying to tell your neighbor what you think about them. My father-in-law had that midah, had that attribute, had that character trait, where he was able to express his feelings and tell them what they thought. Not everyone was always so happy with everything he said. But at the end of the day, you knew where you stood with him, and that's one way that you develop sort of long relationships. So what we have here is superficial shalom, superficial peace, love on the surface, or to get deep down. And that's what I think is meant when we say you should be that you should be kadoshim tiyu. You should sanctify yourself. You should be like God. You emulate God. That you're not just acting just actions, but every action has a purpose, that we have to go lifnim mishura sadim, beyond the letter of the law. The law says do X, give charity, but charity in itself is important and it satisfies a need, but it doesn't really necessarily create that sense of community unless you're really appreciating that person and that person appreciates you. And you really want to create ahava, love, a deep love, a love of not just of action, but a love of respect. And that's a balance we always have to have in life. Sometimes you think that to tell the truth about somebody else is harmful. It's, we say, lashon hara, and you're just causing harm. But sometimes when you hide those feelings, when you hide the truth, you're just covering up a really problematic relationship. And the way to solve that is to create this balance where you don't always say everything you think, but you think about what you're going to say and how that is going to try to change the relationship. And if you act with sincerity, and that's probably the most important point, if you're sincere in what you do, the other person who you're talking to will appreciate that. They'll understand that you don't mean it to be harmful, but rather to be helpful. You don't mean that to cause machlokas, to cause division, but rather you're trying to search for the ultimate love. So hopefully, this idea was something that I learned from my father-in-law, Howard Shwartz, and I hope that whoever's listening to this could just learn that little lesson, that sometimes it's important to speak what you really think, but also think before you speak. And we'll get to the point where we really have an ava, a love of one for another, and we'll go beyond what's expected of us and create something which is deep and meaningful. Good Shabbos.